Now we're in our final session about truth. Remember, we are building a foundation as we head toward the gospel. Not that you're going to be sharing every piece of this foundation with everyone you encounter, of course not. But as we know the details in a much more robust way, as we understand the issues, especially the issues of culture, the potential objections we may face, if we understand those, oh, trust me, you're far more likely to share the gospel. You know why? Because sharing the gospel is kind of scary sometimes. And most of the time, when you ask people, why are you hesitant to share the gospel? It ends up being some form of, I don't want to look stupid. And I'm not sure I can answer this question, or I might misrepresent something, or I might misspeak in some way. What if I do something to harm, their ability to understand that? What if I'm actually a detriment rather than a blessing when it comes? Look, it's always going to be some aspect of fear, and a lot of it is based on fear of not wanting to look dumb. Well, it turns out there's lots of stuff that you don't have any fear about because you know the ins and outs. You know far more details about, for example, if it's your favorite sports team, you can make the case for your favorite sports team with less fear than you can make the case for Christianity. Why? Because you've been watching that team for 15 years and you can tell me the history of their players and their ownership and all that their record and how they did in the playoffs last year. Really? And it's not just that, whatever it is that you're geeked out on, you probably have no fear talking about it. Let's get to a point where we understand all of the building blocks of the Christian worldview deeply enough so we have no fear about this. Now, I'm going to cover one last issue when it comes to truth, and those are the alternative explanations when people try to define truth, especially in a culture and academia has got such an influence on young people. Let's just talk about the way that truth is described in academia, at least, and you'll see it's also described this way in culture. And it'll help you to think about how you want to lock down truth for the people in your life as you share the gospel. So let's just talk about the definition. If I asked you to define truth, how would you define it? And people in your world, if you ask them how to define truth, they're probably going to define it in a way that's been taught to them by the culture or by academia. And there are lots of ways people define truth. Let me give you a few so you can see the differences and why some are better than others. Here's a kind of a standard way that in academia, at least, truth is defined. And it's kind of said this way. It's a theory for truth called pragmatic theory of truth, or sometimes some form of utilitarianism, this idea that truth is whatever works. Now, 2 sessions ago, we talked about isoniazid being the cure for TB. Well, why is that? We don't even know. I don't think they really understood, at least initially, what it was about the chemistry and the biochemistry of tuberculosis that isoniazid necessarily attacked. But you just try enough things, at some point you get a cure. Sometimes people stumble upon a cure accidentally. And how do they know it's the cure? Because it works. So you can see why this might be a popular way to define truth, right? Truth is whatever works. But I'm looking for a theory of truth that works all the time, not just works occasionally. I want a theory of truth that actually I can apply to every situation. Look, I'm a detective and I'm a retired detective. And now we retire early because, the life expectancy in our state for retired police officers is pretty low. And I knew that I'm actually right now past the average life expectancy for retired police officers in my state. Is that awesome? Yeah, but I do think about death a lot. And you know what? It doesn't work for me. Death does not work. There's lots of issues that I think about that really you couldn't define this way. I'll give it to you this way. Have you ever told a successful lie? My wife tells me a successful lie almost every day. It works every time. I'll say, gosh, my hair's getting so thin. And she'll say to me, you have as much hair today as you had in high school, because we knew each other in high school. Really? That's a lie. And it works every time. Because I feel, okay, I can get through another day. I'm not losing my hair. Yes, I am. It's a lie, but it's successful. There are such things as successful lies, and it works. These things work. Just because a statement works does not make it true. So I think that's not a really clear way to define truth, is it? Here's another way that people have defined truth. It's called empiricism, or the empiricist theory of truth. It means basically the truth is whatever we can sense with our empirical senses, the 5 senses. You kind of hear it sometimes when people have a reliance on science, or they trust what the science tells them more than anything else, or that they think that science is the best barometer of what is true. You'll hear this. So, for example, they'll say things like, I can only trust what can be discovered or what can be determined with science. Okay, I just want you to see this sentence for a second. Look at it real closely. We talked about in the last session self-refuting truth claims. And this is a self-refuting claim. This idea that I can only, here's why. Why is it self-refuting? Because this idea that you can only trust what can be discovered with science cannot itself be discovered with science. Yet you think you trust this view. Well, it turns out this is a philosophical view that precedes science. The sciences are not the only way to discover truth. And this is a sentence that cannot be discovered by using some type of empirical scientific process. This is a philosophical position you have to hold prior to doing science. So this statement is, yeah, you guessed it, it's a suicide statement. It's self-refuting. How about this theory of truth? Truth is what I feel. It's emotive. It's emotivism, basically. This idea that truth is discerned by your experiences, by how you feel. By the way, this is still so popular amongst the culture, especially amongst young people. Your truth, my lived experience, your lived experience, most of the time is locked into how it made you feel. But do you realize, of course, that many of us have irrational fears, right? I mean, every audience I've ever talked to, I could ask somebody to raise a hand and share with me what they think is an irrational fear that they hold. And you'd be amazed at some of the things you hear. I had a partner, for example, who was a big guy. I mean, probably about 6'4", 6'5", 280 pounds, probably more like 310, but he'd tell you 280. And this guy, when he was in uniform and we were in patrol, you would not want to stand between him and the bad guy. He had hands the size of like a medium pizza. This dude was huge and strong. A brute strength, right? Like you just did not want to stand between this guy because inertia would start working, right? And a body in motion has a tendency to stay in motion. I didn't want to be between his body and the suspect's body. That's how big this guy was. He'd walk into a room, everyone just did what he said. And you know what? When he got transferred to detectives, I was working in homicide. He came into our unit. And I knew that he had an irrational fear of garden spiders. Actually, any size spider. It could be the smallest, teeniest little spider. So once we all knew that, we would go on the weekends and we would collect spiders and we'd bring them back and release them into his desk, right? Because at some point we just wanted to see him scream like a little girl. And the reason why he would do that is because he had an irrational fear. You cannot always trust what your emotions. And by the way, there are truth claims for about like paper clips. Okay, paper clips, a certain tensile strength, a certain shape. There's a reason why paper clips have not really changed in all the years we've been making paper clips. There are certain truth claims I can make. And by the way, my emotions don't have much to say about it. There are lots of things that don't really have any connectivity to emotions, and emotivism is not going to help you determine what's true, especially since we have so many irrational fears to begin with, irrational emotions. Well, it turns out there's a better definition than all these I've offered so far. And it is called correspondence theory. It is basically that the truth is a relationship between what you believe and what really is. So, for example, if I'm standing outside a room and I think when I walk in the room, there's going to be a table in the middle of the room. That is my belief. I believe that there's a table sitting in the middle of that room. And then I open the door and I walk in the room, and sure enough, there is a table sitting in the middle of the room. Well, now what I believe is equal to what really is. That relationship, that one-to-one correspondence between what you believe being the same as equal to what really is, you hold the truth if what you believe is equal to what really is. Well, you are probably, if you're watching this, you're probably a believer. You probably believe that God exists, but is what you believe about God equal to what really is? That's what we want to do before we start sharing what we believe with others. Let's make sure that we hold the truth, that what we believe corresponds to reality. And you have some beliefs about what Scripture teaches and what it means and what's true about it, and all the different aspects of what you believe about the Bible. Well, then let's make sure that what we believe about the Bible is equal to what really is. And we're going to cover all of that in sessions so that you are prepared to be able to make the case to others. Because that's really the goal, is to have a firm lock on what the nature of truth is, be able to define it in your own head so that when people try to offer a different alternative explanation, you're able to spot the difference and why you need to help them in understanding truth to begin with. And then, of course, to know that what we believe, you've tested it yourself. Now, you might think, well, why is that so important? Well, here's why. Your enthusiasm is directly connected to your preparation. And we'll talk about that in a later session. But if, and also your confidence in a crisis is directly related to your knowledge or your trust that something is evidentially true. I tell a story in Cold Case Christianity about an officer who was kind of a bad guy got the draw on him. He was confronting a guy who was going to eventually take to jail, and this guy decided he was not going to jail, and he had a gun, so he pulled it out on the officer before the officer could do anything. Now the officer is standing facing this guy, and he doesn't even have his hand anywhere near his own gun, and he realizes, I'm about to get shot. But he was wearing a vest, the bulletproof vest that he had seen stop bullets in the range, and because he had a prior evidential basis by which he knew that it was true the vest could stop bullets, he stood calmly in the gunfight. He decided to take the first couple of rounds while he got his gun out, and that's what he did. It turns out the degree to which you know something is true evidentially has an impact on how willing you are to stand in it during a crisis. And for a lot of young people that we are trying to reach with the gospel, and people my age, whoever it is, we are going to encounter some tough times. And you're even going to encounter some tough times sharing the gospel. That's why it's important for us to know that the vests can stop bullets, because then we're far more likely to stand calmly in it when we start to take fire. And that's going to happen in a culture that is starting to reject everything that God teaches in Scripture. So we want to be in a position where we can know Scripture evidentially and know what's true evidentially, know the true nature of truth, so we can share that with others. And that is it for this session.